Good afternoon, listeners, and welcome back to the TechTitans podcast, a place where we discuss different tech related topics and how old and new technologies are helping change the face of the world. I'm your host, Ayush Garg, back with another enthralling episode. I still remember the time I got to know about LiFi, a wireless communication technology that utilizes light to transmit data and position between devices from my father very early on. This started my weeks long venture into making my own Li-Fi device, which ended with a successful music broadcasting concoction and a never ending fascination with networking. Today, to quench that thirst, I invited to my podcast a pioneer in light-speed communication infrastructure, and I was thrilled to know that he too was keen to share his knowledge with me. I'm talking about Mr. Rohit Jha, the young CEO and co-founder of Transcelestial, a startup building a space laser network to deliver a step change in internet connectivity globally. Mr. Jha and his partner Mohammad Danish came up with the idea of bringing fast internet connectivity to the rest of the world through a laser powered network. The young entrepreneurs got an opportunity to work on their idea, and now they are co-owners of their company called Transcelestial. Mr. Jha in particular has been a lifelong tech enthusiast like me. He's also worked on cutting edge projects like NTU's Solar Car, a state of the art healthcare droid, next gen multi touch HCL systems, and represented Singapore in international engineering competitions. Welcome to my podcast, sir. Can you tell the audience a bit about yourself?
Thanks, Ayush. That was a great intro. Yeah, I mean, before I jump into this, I would like to tell your audience that we are not a Li-Fi company, and that there's definitely a difference between Li-Fi is your traditional. Uh, you it's using the same transport mechanism underlying, which is photons, effectively to transmit data. But for Li-Fi companies, what they effectively do is it's mostly an indoor use case
Yeah.
where the use is to use bulbs to transmit data to your phones or laptops and stuff like that. What we are talking about is long range, ultra high bandwidth communications by using lasers. And the difference is effectively a coherent transmission, unlike Wi-Fi, where it can be coherent and incoherent as well. Uh, yeah, so swinging back, just to add a little bit more light to that. So we started this company around 5 years ago in Singapore. We're headquartered here in Singapore. Obviously, I've been here around 10 plus years, starting my journey at NTU in Singapore, and then spending a few years in the investment banking industry, looking at financial markets in the foreign exchange division. And then subsequently, around the time that SpaceX proved that sending something to orbit and bringing back was possible to be done repeatedly, the space era started. And one of the first challenges that we started looking at in the space era was how do you do communications as humanity expands to different moons and different planets in the solar system? That's what the company is looking at.
Fantastic to have you on the show. Let's first start with a bit about networking. So, most of us have internet powered by traditional fiber optics. And for those of you new to this segment, fiber optics is the technology used to transmit information over long distances as pulses of light through strands of fibers made of glass or plastic. It is this technology that provides homes and businesses with fiber optic internet, phone, and TV services. Now, fiber optics is a traditional approach to the transmission of data, and it has already matured to a level where the world is at ease with using it. How is the technology that your company uses different from this one? And can you brief us about how it works?
Sure, absolutely. So let me take a step back and just take you through a journey of how did light-based communications came about. So back in the 50s and 60s, when lasers were first invented, they were called light amplification by stimulated emission of radiation. Before that, the precursor to a laser was maser, where you would do the same kind of transmission by using microwaves. This was partially developed by Bell Labs, which was the research arm for AT&T. And if you go and look up the original patent for laser, one of the first use cases in the first line is using lasers to communicate between cell towers. So as AT&T was expanding around early days in the US, they had this dream of potentially using lasers to communicate wirelessly between their cell towers and offering that connectivity than to users. Of course, at that point of time, a single laser was the size of a massive dining table, and it was impossible for you to put that on a cell tower. So what followed after that was the creation of fiber optics, which is effectively a glass casing around the laser signal that allows you to take that laser signal across not only different buildings, but across continents effectively. So just some statistics. Currently, more than 99% of the world's data goes through fiber optics and undersea cables, and not through satellites, as is the common myth
Yeah.
among people. Now, where does our journey start? So, when we started looking at the infrastructure at which has built 99% of our internet, um, you then start to question, why is more than 50% of the world still unconnected or not having access to broadband level connectivity? And when you pull that thread a little bit more, three big problems arise from that, which effectively act as bottlenecks in having ubiquitous fiber optics connectivity. Bottleneck number one is the big undersea cable networks. So an internet is just a network of networks. And the biggest network of networks are these massive fiber optic cables, which are sitting at the bottom of the ocean. These cables are carrying internet traffic between continents like US and Asia and India and Africa and places, right? So to give you an example, Australia has one or two cables landing, which then is used to transmit data across Australia. Similarly, Singapore has two cables. One comes in the north and one comes in the south, and that is then used to distribute internet to all over Singapore. Each of these cables are roughly, it takes a few years to plan and deploy, and billions of dollars to deploy under the sea. It's a huge investment. And even then, it only connects two continents. The second big bottleneck is effectively, once these cables come up, how do you then take that and distribute to cities? Now, Singapore is easier, it's a single city, but think more on bigger countries like China and India and Indonesia, which has like 16, 17,000 islands. How do you then take that and then plug it into major cities and smaller towns and smaller villages? That is usually the mandate of telecom networks, but they are commercially driven enterprises. And they obviously plan these networks to be centered around from where they can get maximum growth, which is the big cities where the big population live. So that's why historically smaller towns and smaller villages have been left away. And that's where a big chunk of the world's population lives as well. And the final distribution bottleneck is effectively the within the city itself. How do you then take that and plug it into your 4G, 5G cell towers, your hospitals, your enterprises? Now, we saw issues around all these three big bottlenecks. To counteract the first two issues of large scale distribution of internet, that's where our space program is all about. Our space program allows us to effectively take that laser out of the fiber core, put it into a satellite, and then drop it in an instant in the middle of any town, any village in the world. So imagine a fiber optics like connectivity dropped in the middle of entire population of a town, which can then be distributed locally by the local broadband provider or the telco provider. So this instantly eliminates the need for spending billions of dollars and years and decades planning these fiber networks, where you can get it instantly. We are talking about speeds where, if you look at the current satellite networks like Starlink and OneWeb, we are you talk where they are capable of doing 500 megabits to maybe a gigabits per second. We're talking about speeds which are going into hundreds of gigabits and terabits of connectivity. So it's really a massive change. And again, a wishful thinker could then think how this could be expanded to deep space by extending a laser link all the way to the moon, to a Mars base, and beyond that. On the short term, in the city level, we have products now which use the same technology and allow us to wirelessly shoot lasers between buildings and cell towers to effectively create a wireless fiber optic connectivity. And again, this is also helping solve expansion of fiber within existing cities.
This is very fascinating. No matter how mature I think old technologies get new innovations like these are the way to future. Talking about innovations, I heard, as you said, Elon Musk Starlink is doing something very similar with internet technologies. What are your thoughts on this, and how is Transcelestial set apart from the competition right now?
Yeah, good question. I think first of all, what Elon and SpaceX are doing, they are clearing the forest for the rest of us, right? It's an absolute fantastic piece of work that the team at SpaceX is doing. They are helping put together a way for us to build and bring technology into space. Um, Starlink came about and is addressing a very different market segment than what we are looking at. And I'll give you an example. If you look at the world, and we talked about the population and the connectivity within the population centers, and you eliminate all the country boundaries and state boundaries and stuff, you can re-segment the world into population clusters, right? So let's
Yeah,
imagine a linear scale going from left to right, where on the left you have really tiny and small population centers, which are like farms or people on a mountain, or maybe people in boats and ships and stuff, right? Small people, their bandwidth and their internet needs are very tiny because they are probably looking at emails or they're looking at maybe one or two videos. And as you go from left to right on that population scale, you start hitting small towns, small villages, which keep expanding into metro cities and mega cities of the world, right? What's happening is that the population is moving from left to right. Bigger cities are getting bigger and
yeah,
smaller cities are getting smaller in number. But there's in the next 5 to 10 years, there is still a significant population at the bottom of the distribution. And Starlink game and aim is to effectively make sure that there is no one who is unconnected to the internet,
yeah,
right? That is completely different from what we are trying to look at. Transcelestial's vision is to solve humanity's long-term communication needs. And that stems from the fact that all of the bigger population groups, the demand for data is exponentially rising.
yeah.
So each of these groups, they are going from requiring, let's say, 1 or 10 gigabits to hundreds of gigabits and terabits of connectivity to satisfy their demands. And what we are looking at is the future of connectivity. And we are saying that if the data keeps exponentially growing and all these population groups are growing, that means the smaller cities will become bigger cities and the bigger cities will become even bigger cities, and their demands for data will keep growing massively. A technology like Starlink or OneWeb is great for these tiny little population clusters, but they don't have enough juice to power the next generation of applications for that. Now, again, we are building the backbone of the internet. So we are making sure that these population groups are getting a core pipe of internet traffic, but we are working with telecoms and internet providers locally to provide the last mile service and connectivity to the end users, because these guys usually know the countries and they know what their customers like and stuff. So we are bringing the internet to these population groups, and then we are working very closely with your favorite ISP or telco provider who can come up to your house and help bridge that connection from our laser link to your internet devices.
Right. So this kind of seems like, to me, it seems like a sensation in networking right now. I think all of us are very curious about the viability of this whole concept. Has it reached a level where it can be implemented in real life, or are we still waiting for some strides in research right now?
Absolutely. So that's a very good question. As always, there are elements that are absolutely present now. So let's talk about a system called the TRL levels. So those who are familiar with how NASA deals with things and stuff, TRL levels are technology readiness level, and it's a scale from 1 to 10, which talks about how early a technology is in that.
Yeah.
Okay, so a scale of 1 or 2 means that it's you're doing diagrams on a computer simulation, and a scale of 6 or 7 or 8 means you are ready for manufacturing and you're doing large scale manufacturing and you're putting that out. Um, as we mentioned, currently we already are deploying tech with our partners in Asia Pacific, so telecoms and ISPs, where they're using this technology within the city. So if you talk about urban cities, like a quick example is we are working with telcos in the region, including in Singapore, who are using this technology to build up a wireless laser mesh on which they will build their 5G network. So if you're a telecom and you're going from a 4G to a 5G network, 5G is a much shorter distance technology. To
Yeah.
give you an example, a single 4G cell tower can cover a 3 to 5 kilometer radius of residents and handsets. A 5G cell tower can only go 500 meters to a kilometer.
Yeah.
So you are seeing that in order to build this kind of infrastructure, internet needs to be brought to these cell towers. And if you're seeing such a huge amount of infrastructure cost, using a wireless laser allows you to very rapidly set up a mesh within a city with on top of which you can build your 4G and 5G network. So this is a technology very much being manufactured in Singapore. We are scaling that up. We are producing hundreds and potentially thousands of devices in the future, which are going out to our clients in Asia Pacific and soon in EMEA and the US, where they'll use this for accelerating the adoption of 5G. So tomorrow, if you wake up and your data speeds are suddenly twice as fast, that's thanks to us. And it has happened. A quick example is recently, one of our investors is Globe Telecom in Manila. And we recently took a small part of Manila and we overnight switched it over from a traditional wireless technology like microwave to our laser communications. And instantly, within a few minutes, and for the rest couple of days, we saw latencies drop by nearly 30 to 50%. That means real-time applications could be used much better by drop in latency. And we saw data speeds go up by at least two to two and a half times.
Right. This sounds really exciting. I am very curious about the technicalities of this technology. Can you just brief me about how your lasers actually work and how data is being transmitted and received?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's important to drill down in terms of first principles. When you pick apart a communication system like laser communications, it boils down to three big buckets. Bucket number one is how do you put data into light, right?
Yeah.
Bucket number two is how do you uh, compensate for vibrations and do active pointing and tracking. And the reason for that is if you have ever held a laser pointer in your classroom, you must have noticed that like with a little bit of a shake of your hand, the laser moves very widely.
Yeah.
When you are talking about distances which are kilometers and hundreds of kilometers and thousands of kilometers in space, a movement of a 10 to the power minus third of a degree in laser can move the laser beam by tens to hundreds of kilometers.
I agree.
So it's very important to have extremely precise pointing and tracking technology. And to give your listeners an idea of what that technical numbers translate into, is that if you are sitting in, let's say, Tokyo,
Hmm.
with our systems today, you can hit uh, a glass of water in Singapore with a laser by
Oh,
sitting in Tokyo. So that's the kind of precision we're talking about. And the third bucket that we talk about is, so first one was how do you put data into light? Second was how do you do active pointing and tracking? And the third one is how do you compensate for atmospheric losses in signal to noise in your signal? That means how do you maintain your signal to noise ratio? For those who are in the engineering field might understand that when you send data streams through the open atmosphere, a lot of those data packets could get lost because of rain or smog or
hmm.
fog, and it's absorbed and they turn into noise. Your goal as a communications provider is to make sure that your signal, that means your accurate bits, are always more than your noise, so that the customer can get that famous Netflix show that they want to stream accurately. And what the team is working on are pretty much all three aspects. How do you put data into light? We have borrowed a lot of this technology from the fiber optics industry. And as you said, it's been mature over
Yeah.
the last couple of decades. They have spent billions and tens and hundreds of billions of dollars in making sure that this data into light works up to tens and up to 50s, tens and 50s of terabits per second, right? So it's been done. And we borrow a lot of concepts from there. What as a team we have been working on are the second and the third problems. How do you do very precise and commercially available pointing and tracking technology? And how do you compensate for noise and signal to noise ratio in very varied weather conditions like rain and snow and haze and fog and etc. Um, yeah, but building something like that is very different from building something like that scalably, repeatedly, and manufacturably. In the
Yeah.
last 30 years, there were many people who were making hobby electric cars in their garages. It was super easy. You put a
Mm.
DC motor, you put a battery, and you have a car. Doing that repeatedly with quality was so difficult and was nearly impossible until Tesla came around.
Right, right, right. So with Transcelestial, we're basically talking about lasers pointing in the air and it being received on the other end. And like whatever noise was created has been reduced by the team to transfer the perfect data.
Exactly.
Right. And in doing this, you're able to provide speeds which are unseen anywhere.
Absolutely. To give you an example, the current wireless industry, which is basically what you use in Wi-Fi. Actually, your Wi-Fi signals are very state of the art, and they are technically faster than your even 5G connections.
Yeah.
Uh, those, sorry about that. Those Wi-Fi signals effectively are kind of state of the art. And what we can do with traditional wireless technology, which is employed by Starlink and OneWeb and all of these guys, um, is something that's taken like over 50 or 100 years to mature. And they have
Mhm.
reached a point where they can at max do something around 10 Gbps wirelessly.
Mhm.
When we started, our first product was 10 Gbps, the first product, which took us 2 years to
Right.
build. And in the last 2 years, we have already tested in our labs capability, which can wirelessly deliver not only 100 gigabits per second, but we have designs which take that to a terabit capability in
Mhm.
wireless. This is the world's fastest wireless technology that ever existed.
Okay, this indeed sounds really, really exciting. But I think we need to address the elephant in the room. Why do we need such high networking speeds anyways? I mean, why can't we just make fiber optics technology more accessible? For most users in Singapore, internet speeds close to hundreds of megabytes per second are a reality. So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, good question. And the answer is not a technical one, but the answer comes from is a financial one.
Hmm.
Um, the success of any communication network comes from a single metric. And this is a metric which you can apply to not only your local telco or broadband provider, but you can also apply to Starlink and OneWeb and any other company. And that metric is cost per bit. How can you deliver the maximum number of bits of data at the
Hmm.
lowest amount of cost? Fiber optics as a technology is definitely, as of today, until were present, before we came into the picture, fiber optics was that technology, which was the
Right.
lowest cost per bit. And that is why it has taken over as 99%. But the reality is that there are massive infrastructure finance houses around the world. These are banks and private equity funds and national pension funds and all of these massive, massive companies who have spent billions and billions of dollars into the infrastructure with the hope that this infrastructure will last the next 5, 10 years, and you can make back the initial upfront investment through usage and economic development. So when a country like Singapore 10, 15 years ago invested in a fiber optic infrastructure, their hope was that would give rise to an economic powerhouse that is built on a digital infrastructure, and that would help them recover those costs in the long run. It's extremely easy to do that on a country which is
Yeah.
so small. But when you start looking at the sizes of countries like Australia and Indonesia and India and China, getting that kind of fiber footprint in the ground is insanely expensive. To give you a quick
Mhm.
example, Roughly, when you look at deploying fiber in the ground, the costs are around $60 to $100 per meter.
Oh.
Every meter of fiber that you're deploying is around $60 to $100 per meter. When we came onto the scene, we have brought down that price point from $60 to $100 to $5 to $10 per meter.
Hmm.
Does that make
That
sense?
yeah, that indeed makes sense. And I think the future of networking and how faster internet speeds are going to allow for greater advances in fields like VR also needs to be addressed. I mean, I can come up with a few applications in my head as well, or like telemedicine, where almost zero latency provides a huge advantage.
Yeah, massive. I mean, the latency is key, and I can give you a quick example of how things will change with us. Right now, if you look at, let's take an example of Southeast Asia because we are in Southeast
Yeah,
Asia. Um, right now, every single person who's streaming videos, let's say from maybe not every single person, but like majority of the population that are streaming videos in Netflix or YouTube in Indonesia or Malaysia or Philippines, the way it works is that someone will type the name of a YouTube video, click on that, and that request is sent from their handphone to the cell tower through the existing wireless or fiber optic network, all the way back to the YouTube servers, which are in this region, are in Singapore. And from
yeah.
here, that video is then streamed out bit by bit through all of that undersea cables, through like 20
Hmm.
different fiber networks to that person. And that takes around 10 to 12 milliseconds, sometimes 20 to 30 milliseconds, depending on how crappy the intermittent networks are. When you're talking about voice calls, these kind of latencies don't work. When you're talking about um, um, synchronized game servers in MMORPG, these kind of latencies don't work. Streaming video games doesn't work. Uh, so how can we change all of that? We can change all of that by two ways. Either we move these servers closer to our customers, but that requires huge amounts of infrastructure and capex costs again in building these massive data centers closer to our population. Or you can use someone like Star Transcelestial's network, where what would happen effectively is that with our lasers, we could effectively pick up an entire traffic from, let's say, Jakarta on YouTube requests and drop it down into the data center in Singapore with less than 3 to 5 milliseconds latency.
Hmm.
So anywhere in Southeast Asia, whether it's a town, village, island, someone's house in the middle of a forest, anyone will be able to connect back to gaming and networking and media streaming services in Singapore with around 3 to 5 milliseconds of round trip latency. And that is so much powerful when it comes to like not only entertainment, but also mission critical applications like medicine and telehealth.
Yeah, and I can see a huge financial advantage as well because cloud computing is taking the storm right now. I mean, most of the applications which we see on the internet are based in cloud servers. There's home-based servers have been reduced drastically. And the
Yeah.
thing you talked about, electronics are effectively cheaper in some states than the others, and building data centers closer to home isn't going to help. I think this mission of yours, making technology more accessible rather than making it closer is what fascinates me. One other thing I would like to ask you is what kind of input can you take as your data? I mean, what is your limit? Can you take the entirety of YouTube's traffic in Jakarta and transfer it to Singapore? What are the current thresholds you're bound with?
Yeah, good question. So generally, a typical city generates something in the orders of um, if you look at daily numbers in Singapore, you will be looking at numbers which are again somewhere between ranges between 300 400 gigabits per second to a daily traffic of around 7 800 gigabits per second. In Jakarta, that number would be a little bit lower. If you combine a few cities in Indonesia or Philippines, uh, maybe you could reach up to like a terabit per second and stuff. So with our first satellites, we'll be able to target a speed of 100 gigabits per second. And that's because the first satellites will not be WDM enabled, which is a technology which you use to go up to the terabit range.
Right.
Um, so we will be kind of hovering in the range of 100 gigabits. So maybe not metro cities, but when you're talking about tier two, tier three cities like Cebu and Bali and like anything which is not a massive sprawling metropolis, absolutely, 100%. Without any doubts, you can easily channel that traffic. Uh, when you're, but you want to kind of start to have a bigger and bigger pipe so you can channel to more and more of these population centers. So the next version 2 or version 3 of our products will effectively be WDM enabled. That allows us to then commit a terabit, 2 terabits, 5, 10, 20 terabits easily. Then we can start to channel traffic from an entire nation.
Right.
So each of these undersea cables that I initially talked about, like an example is, as I said, Singapore brings in 2 undersea cables. Each of these cables are 1 to 2 terabit in capacity, maybe 3 terabit capacity. So I can totally see that by our third version of our satellites, we can actually start carrying traffic from a small part of the nation or maybe the entire nation.
And how
And
will,
again,
okay.
you can extend this concept to deep space as well. All we have to do is flip one of our satellites and then drop a data center on the moon, and connect it to a 1 terabit link with Earth. And you have very high speed cloud connectivity all the way to the moon.
Right. So what you're effectively saying is the system which Transcelestial is providing will come into the real life in patches because the current technology is not allowing it to handle metropolitan city. So it will have to function in accordance with existing frameworks. It's not an entire replacement. You're saying it's just a
Yeah,
part
no,
in
it
the process.
absolutely, no, absolutely not. It's not a replacement. Where you have already deployed a fiber optic cable, where or the investment has already been made, it would be quite uh, not worthwhile for us to rip that infrastructure out. But as we are seeing, is that like a majority of the developing world is still struggling with the deployment of cables. Um, in majority of the world now, you build a house where you can find space,
Hmm.
and big issues in deploying fiber come into the fact that you have to individually go to all these people and ask them permissions to use their space to put a fiber in the ground. Going wireless often is much faster and is a much more scalable way for us to bring these high bandwidth pipes to a lot of these use cases.
And then I think not only the internet, but peer-to-peer connections and maybe private networks are also a segment that can be addressed with this
Yeah,
technology.
pretty much. I mean, it's a pipe. You can do
Yeah,
whatever you want. You can
yeah,
send public
exactly.
internet, you can send private internet, you can set different kinds of traffic, UDP, TCP, fixed protocols. Yeah.
I think now it's time to stem a bit from the technical side of things and talk a bit about startups and entrepreneurship. So, what made
Mhm.
you start your own startup, and how do you think students who dream about becoming entrepreneurs like you can climb up the ladder?
Right. That's a good question. Starting a company is not a wise career choice. Let me put it this way.
Yeah,
Um, if you're interested in just earning some cash and stuff, you're far better off joining a stable company or MNC and stuff. So why would you start a company? You would start a company because there are very few people in this world who are actually working on the hard problems. And what really is a company? A company is basically a realization of the future in the present. Every single person who has started a company or every single team, let's not say a person, because
yeah.
usually the success of the company is the founding team and the first few employees. Every single team which has started a company, they have envisioned a future where that company and that service and that technology exists, and they have said, damn it, it needs to be done today, right? And you'll be surprised that there's not a lot of people doing that. And as humans, that's the big urge that drives us all. What I recommend, even if you're a student, or if you are, even if you are someone who has spent 10 years in a company or 20 years in a company, or you're 50 years old, it's never too late to start a company. There's far less people starting companies now than they were 100 years ago. So it's quite important for you to step, first things first, work on things which are hard. Don't work on things which are easy, like, oh, let me solve this delivery app problem. um, there's a lot of people doing that, and you have only but one life. So you want to kind of work and gain knowledge and gain capabilities to be able to work on the hard problems. That's number one. Number two, if you are starting one of these companies, it's always almost efficient to get yourself to centers or locations in the world where you will find like-minded people. The reality is that, like, you could be sitting in your small hometown or your small city and thinking that, like, oh, let me start this here. Often the difference between a great company and no company is just five other people that you get to talk to who share your same level of enthusiasm. There's a reason why Paris was Paris in the 1700s and 1800s. And there's a reason why Silicon Valley is Silicon Valley, and Singapore is Singapore, and Israel is Israel, and London is London, because people with similar mindsets have gathered around, and they don't shy away from conversations about changing the world. So get yourself to those centers and then talk to as many people as possible. I have blog post on my blog which talks about the learnings I've had in the last uh, 10 years of my life, as I passed through my 20s. One of the biggest things that when you look back, you realize is that in your 20s, when you are younger, it's much easier to get drunk and socialize with people. And the kind of relationships that you make in your 20s will carry into your professional lives in your 30s and 40s, and will help you become more successful. So use your 20s when you are students to work and network and talk to people who are doing meaningful things in their life and can help you, guide you along the way. So as long as you're doing these three things, I think you'll do just fine.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, the point you said of tackling harder problems, I think right now, if we talk about human innovation, there can only be more progress if we tap into a full well, a well which is already being used by people. There's no point just dripping water out of it. If we are tackling a problem that has not been scratched, there'll obviously be bigger risks but bigger returns, and on the whole, a bigger progress for humanity. Now, another curiosity of mine is, when should a person take the effort to start their venture? I mean, even Forbes claimed that 90% of all the startups fail. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, 10% succeed. That's great. That's good odds. Um, well, when you talk about when, I mean, statistically, people, uh, there's lots of ways you can do that. I think you should start a startup when you feel like you have the the kind of drive to do something meaningful, and that drive can come at the age of 16 and 17, and it could come at the age of 45. Um, Often it gets initiated by things that are happening. One of the things that one of my favorite people to follow, and a potential dinner guest, if I could have him, was Richard Feynman. He was a theoretical physicist, part of the Manhattan Project, Nobel Prize winner. And if you listen and read to some of the things that he would say, one of the things he said, the success to him being able to get to a Nobel Prize, and other kinds of things like Feynman diagrams, was that throughout his life, he picked out 4 or 5 areas and challenges that interested him. These were hard problems about quantum mechanics and quantum field theory and stuff. And every single interaction in maths, physics, literature, chemistry, music that he would come across, he would put every single bit of learning to those problems and would ask himself that, does this new interaction help me solve any of these challenges? And when he finally was, I think, working with music and stuff, like, he got the idea of using diagrams. to show interaction of subatomic particles, and that became the famous Feynman diagrams, right? Like it's easy.
Yeah.
By scribbling, you could solve higher order differential equations. Um, and that's basically the answer. Pick out interesting problems in your life early on, or areas that you find are always interesting, and always be on the lookout for that insight, which allows you to disrupt that field. The other way to look at this is that if you're really a forward thinker, you can look at how should the world look like 50 years from now. So
Hmm.
imagine you're James Cameron and you're building a movie in the future, and you have to do all this world building, right? So if you imagine a future that's 50 years from now that you would absolutely love to live in, then what are the technologies or services or socioeconomic features in that future that
Hmm.
you absolutely would love to have? And then you work backwards from that. Okay, how could you achieve that in 40 years, 30 years, 20 years, 10 years? And that becomes the milestones of your company.
Right. I think what Transcelestial and you have achieved is quite remarkable and has left me honestly very inspired. So, Rohit, where do you see this whole technology going in the future? I think it's inevitable that in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years' time, we can see a lot of competition spring up in this category. Also, just as fiber optics is being presented with this substitute, which you're talking about, with this another framework, there can be another technology that might come up and replace this one. So, has Transcelestial thought about this, and what is their strategy against this?
Well, I mean, like if I told you, I would have to shoot you. Uh, no, but the short answer is this. I think it's been proven time and again that humans are absolutely awful at predicting the future. Uh, and so I would not sit here and claim to predict what the future would look like, but what I can answer what it should look like and what Transcelestial is looking at. Today, as I said, the single metric we are working on is lowering the cost per bit and making something which is scalable not only in the next 5 years, but also can be scaled up in the next 10, 20 years, where we strongly feel that humanity is going to be multiplanetary, right? Um, so as we start to build towards that, there are certain themes that start to play. Lasers might be the best way to deliver that communication today. But as a team, we continue to discuss and think about what could be the next frontier, or even within lasers, how could you pack more and more information? How could you make the systems even better, more efficient, more scalable, more manufacturable, etc. Right? Um, Communications, along with energy, are the two big pillars of our civilization, and the pillars on which the Kardashev scales of civilizations are based on. So as Transcelestial, as we are looking at solving humanity's long-term communication needs, as we start to tackle that challenge, there is a lot of interest within the company to grow and not only look at communication as a challenge, but then start asking questions about what are the other challenges that humanity sees in the long term. And I'll stop there because it's starting to get it may get a bit science fictiony for your
Yeah.
listeners, but the team's very actively thinking about those kind of things in the future. But we have lots to deliver and achieve in the short run first.
A hat tip to you, sir, for informing the viewers with your expertise. And with this, I would like to wrap up the third episode of Tech Titans podcast. Is there anything you would like to tell the audience?
No, thanks for having me on, and it was a very enjoyable conversation. Appreciate it.
Thank you, sir, and I thank for everyone who tuned in. This was the third episode of Tech Titans podcast, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thank you, everyone.